Well, hello everyone. Yes, we're going to talk about trust, and the reason we're going to talk about it is because it's like blood pressure. It's silent, but it's vital to our health, and it's also important to keep an eye on it. And we have been keeping an eye on it. And if I go to the first chart, I've forgotten the clicker, I think. Bear with me a moment. We can see that trust is not all it could be in our industry. So let's have a look. This is us versus other professions. And we're the one basically we are the purple one. I mean, the only way we can improve it is by putting estate agents on there. You know, it's not good. Now, it's not as bad as it could be, because we've seen some improvement. You can see from the way the chart's moved over the last few years. And we'll come on to talk about some of the things that we've been trying to do to help with that. But today we're going to look at, in a bit more detail, why it's so important and perhaps what's causing that lack of trust that we can see there. I've dug out this old chart as well, just to give you some idea of how things have changed over a long period of time. So on the far left, we're talking about 1992, and total favourability. Favourability and trust are very closely linked. We can't compare like with like because we didn't have the same data. But if we look at favourability, we can see that we were up 48% in the early 90s. And I think if we go back further into the 80s, even higher than that. So there's been a dramatic fall from grace, if you like. So we're going to try and unpick all of that now and see if we can come up with any interesting insights. And I'm lucky to have such good panelists with me today, all experts in their field, as you know. And I've asked them each just to speak a little bit first about the issue of trust, and then we'll ask some questions and see where we go from there. So James, what do you think about all this?
Well, I think it's all relative, and I think we probably shouldn't get too excited about that slight uptick in favourability, because it's probably relative, and relative to a media landscape where I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, I know people talk about we live in a post-truth world.
Peak bullshit.
Yeah, I think we may be living in a post-truth world right now. And, you know, when you look at what's happening with digital platforms and, you know, they're moving away from fact-checking and so on, and just the whole political discourse. So perhaps we've improved, but it's just relative to decline elsewhere. And so on. I think that there's no doubt that when we look at what we do, we are still in a situation where we're putting our messages into people's lives. And I think whilst that's by a myriad of more diverse channels than ever before, I think we need to be very, very aware of that responsibility. And I think it sort of almost falls to us on two levels. I think there's a quantitative element to it and a qualitative element, and quantitatively, I think it works in two ways. First of all, I think we need to get our facts right, and I think we need to be very clear that, you know, I think it's McCann have that phrase, which is, it's a truth well told, and so on. So I think we need to be vigilant with ourselves that we're always insightful in our communications, but we're dealing in the truth. Even if we're amplifying it, it's still the truth, and so on. So I think there's a qualitative factual element, quantitative factual element. I think there's another quantitative element to trust, and that's that responsibility not to pollute people's lives. If we simply create so much material, so much collateral that spreads out across people's kind of comms and digital lives, all we're doing is hounding them. And I think, you know, we're sort of quantitatively overwhelming them and making ourselves less welcome even than we ever were before. So I think there's a quantitative element to trust, but there's a qualitative element as well, where it's our responsibility to turn up in a way that improves people's lives. So we should, whether that's showing them something inspiring or something that's actually useful or increases their fund of knowledge or understanding of things, and so on. And I think probably summing it up, there's a really good phrase from I think there was a founder of the Victorian arts and crafts movement, William Morris. He said, have nothing in your life which is neither beautiful or useful. And I think if we make sure that what we're creating is either beautiful or useful or ideally both, then I think that will help trust in what we do.
You reminded me of something Martin Bose said, actually, back in the early days of commercial television, and it was along similar lines. You know, if you're going to introduce yourself into someone's sitting room, he was thinking of TV ads, you at least ought to think about being polite and possibly entertaining. Yep. They might then like you a little bit more. You know, so I think that theme is something you're touching on there. We'll perhaps come back to that. Miranda, what's your take?
Well, actually, a lot chimes with what James is saying. So I do think people have always been sceptical about advertising and advertising executives particularly. And I think that that's continuing to a certain extent, although there may be a glimmer of hope that, you know, trust is kind of building somewhat. But I think that the environment we're in now, which you sort of point to, this macro picture, is like nothing we've seen before in terms of how trust is being sort of eroded and truth is being eroded day by day, actually hour by hour. I was talking to someone, it's kind of like one of those times where decades are happening in a week. You just, every time you look at your newsfeed, things have happened at such a rate, and many of those are eroding at trust and truth. So I think the context is sort of just hard to grapple with. But to think of that context and then sort of the backdrop of that provided for our industry and what we do, and thinking about how people buy into our brands and buy into businesses and organisations, trust is increasingly important in the decisions that they make. So I think there was a piece of research done by Accenture last year that said that actually 53% of people will move away from a brand that they don't trust. And actually, I think the Advertising Association last year talked about the second biggest driver of effectiveness and commercial sort of value for brands is now trust. And it used to be the seventh driver a decade ago. So there are big changes going on that mean that trust is even more vital now than it ever has been. So I think that's interesting in terms of what's going on more broadly and then what matters to us as agencies and brands. So what can we do about it? I think we do need to, I love the truth well told. I also thought of that. So I hope there are some McCann people here because we love your positioning. And so the truth well told, you know, we have to double down on how we're talking about our clients' brands and products. And actually their products need to be really good. You know, we need to make sure that the services that brands and businesses are providing really uphold the promises that we are then talking about in our work and in our communications. And then when it comes to the communications, tell the truth, tell it in a way that entertains and makes people feel really engaged in that brand on an emotional level. You know, it's something we talk about at Adam and Eve, feeling first advertising, because we know that when people feel emotionally engaged, it pays back for the brand over the long term. So that's really important. I think also, of course, and Josh was just talking about AI and the emergence of that, I think in the development of our communications, let's make sure that we're thinking about the craft. And it's not that AI doesn't have a role to play, but I think humans love to see the sort of imprints of creativity and human touch on the work and the ideas that we create to sell those brands and businesses. And then just thinking about media choices, it was interesting just hearing the panel on stage just now, but you know, we do need to make sure that we are upholding the standards, which it sounds like we are. It's great to hear all the detail, on those different media platforms so that there's a quality media environment for our brand's messages. So that's going to help with trust too. And finally, if we do all those things, I think it's really important for talent now coming into our business, coming into our agencies, the brands, you know, they want to be in an environment that feels safe and that feels like they can do their best work. And I think the foundation of that is trust. So yeah, they're my thoughts. Chiming with yours very much.
Yeah, and we also know from, you know, nearly 50 years of IPA effectiveness awards now that trust is an ever-present in those campaigns that are the most effective. So you know, we aren't talking about something that's a side issue here. It's very central to the success of what we do. But Rat, can we talk to you next? Because of course you're coming at it from the point of view of a media owner, and I would have thought it's an even bigger issue for you guys. Perhaps you could shed a bit of light.
Sure. Well, firstly, Paul, thanks for inviting me on day 19 of me being at Channel 4. Trust is earned, right? You've got to start there. Trust is earned. And I love that you've already started with the Credos Trust Tracker. You know, sitting at the top of that from a channel perspective is TV, and has always been TV. And I think TV carries a superpower, and that superpower is friction. Now, that friction is the governance and regulation, which ensures that the content that we put out all across all TV is of a standard that implicits trust. trust from the audiences. And I think that can't be overlooked at all. Now, why is that important? And again, look, preaching to all of the converted here, but you need the trust, to your point, James, in terms of, in really empowering an action. And for all of us, it's about someone going and buying a product. So, what I would really urge everyone to have a look at is ThinkBox's Profitability 2.0 research, because what that illustrates is for platforms that are most trusted, it drives the most profitability for all companies. It's a great piece of research done with Josh's a lot of Group M and also Ubiquity. And, and again, I'd implore all CMOs and CFOs to go and have a look at that, because I think it's really, really important. But there is a challenge. There is a huge challenge. And that challenge, last week we came out with our Gen Z research. And our Gen Z research, called Trends, Trust and Truth, really focuses on, clearly what we are actually seeing. And what we see there, firstly, actually one good thing here for this generation is that they trust advertising more than older cohorts. So that's brilliant, right? So that's great. But they have a real challenge with what is truth. So last week, Alex, as I'm sure you're all aware, my boss, she came out and actually called for action, urgent action, in industry action as well, around regulation, around ensuring that young people know that they are viewing and reading content which is coming from a source which is of a truth nature. And it's broken into 3 areas. One is very much centered around a trust mark. So I do want to share this, is a trust mark that all social media platforms should carry when that content is coming from these recognized organizations. Secondly, of course, we've touched on AI here. How are we training the AI to ensure that, there's no bias there? And I think there's such good news content that's out there that should be used for the training. And then thirdly, which is also massively important, it's a matter of ensuring that we support this generation, and it is our future. So there's a lot of work to do, for sure.
Yes, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning that we'd seen an improvement, a slight improvement, and there seems to be some evidence that that's due to the recommencement of a campaign for the Advertising Standards Authority. So, when I first came into the business, those ads appeared in pretty much every magazine and newspaper. I mean, they were often in small spaces, but they were like drip, drip, drip. If the ad you see isn't honest, decent and truthful, let us know, And it kind of it reminded people that there was a Bobby on the beat. Now, we've come back with a new campaign. It's been great because it's involved lots of existing advertisers, and the tracking on that seems to show exactly what you're saying. If you tell people, we're doing this properly, they are reassured and they have a good feeling about it. So that's good. I mean, without being too controversial, can I ask you whether you thought the recent sort of about turn by Mark Zuckerberg in terms of fact checking, going to community notes, do you think that is likely to have an effect on the issue of trust and what we're talking about, or do you think it's very much just over there and not something that we need to worry about particularly? It's not happened here yet, as far as I know, but although it might be coming down the line. James, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly going to have an effect, and I think one of the US right's favourite phrases about draining the swamp. Well, I think the danger of removing fact-checking is the swamp's going to gently fill up again. And it's one of those things where, we have a responsibility for the messages we create, but also they're hugely affected by their context and where they appear. And I think if those trusted sources become less trusted, then our messaging within those sources becomes less trusted. It's just that it's a sort of corrosion of the environment.
Absolutely. Well, in RAC, this is your point exactly.
Well, totally. You mentioned there, Paul, about ASA and what ASA do. That regulation and governance is massively important. It massively is important. So do more of those ads, please do.
Well, because wish we had more money.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Don't come and talk to me later then. But on that point, I think we have to ensure that there's audiences, generations out there that need to know that this is truthful. And then that will, create trust. And then that will help advertisers. That will help advertisers sell their stories in the best way. That will help these folk create amazing messages that Josh has showed up there as well, right? So if you don't do this foundational construct, then where's this all going to end? Here, right?
Yeah, here.
Just one clap. What?
let me ask Miranda, because your agency is famous for big brand building. advertising. It occurred to me, and this is not based on any evidence, but there seems to be more emphasis by advertisers on the transaction, getting people to buy the product with more short-term performance-style marketing. Do you think that trend has got in the way of, and maybe less time being spent on brand building, the sort of trust building that we've been talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, yes, and if Les was here, he would talk about the 60-40 rule, which I think many of us know, which is that you need to invest 60% of your budget in that brand building work, and that brand building work is there to build sort of emotional human connections with your audience, to prime them for the 40% of the investment, which is in those moments where you get more transactional. And I think what's really interesting about that thinking is that it has endured and it continues to be, Les and Peter Field went back to the thinking 10 years after the publishing of The Long and the Short of It, and it's still held really, really firm. So I think, yes, we need to invest enough in that sort of really fundamental brand building, because that is where we can create those human sort of connections with the brands. So I'm all for transactional when you need it, because you primed them to be in that moment to then transact when they want to buy into your brand or your business. But we need to get the balance right.
I mean, I think I'd look back to when we used to work on John Lewis together, and you had a brand there that had an incredible following wind of trust, and doing research on campaigns that were about things like sustainability and sourcing. You'd be testing messaging and things like that. And it was astonishing how much people believed about 300% more of John Lewis than was actually the truth about the quality of sourcing and things like that, because the brand had trust. And it is easily lost, but if you've got it, it's an incredible multiplier, which is probably why we have to guard it so carefully when we're working with brands.
And broadening out my comment about Mr. Zuckerberg, I mean, and your earlier remarks about post-truth world, what's going on in the world generally? Do you think I mean, you made the point, right, that younger people are more trusting of advertising, but could it be the case that people are just more kind of worried about everything that they're reading and hearing, and that would include our work as well? Or do you think, I'm getting overblown ideas about how important we are? What do you think?
Right. I can go. I like any trend that's going up, right? So I think you're right about relativity and so on, but the role of the advertiser, the role of the brand, the role of the influencer is becoming more and more important. And I think it's more where people are looking for trust, where people are looking for truth. And I think that's a massive, again, citing Josh, he talks about opportunity. That's the opportunity for sure that all of us have a responsibility around.
And I think also when if you look at it and you go, looking back, it's more than trust in advertising. I think you look at it and go, it's about brands. And
yeah, totally.
And some of the brands that we would look at now and go, they're part of the fabric of our kind of commercial society. You look at things like supermarkets and, the big grocers now, a lot of them started from a position of trust. So people couldn't trust the food that they were buying or the drink that they were getting and things like that. And supermarkets came in and said, if you buy it from us, you won't become ill, your children won't get ill, etc. And that trust sort of persists and grows because those brands now exist throughout our communities and society and so on. And I think what's interesting is as I think in that post-truth world, as things start to falter a bit around us, I think the potential for brands to be those points of constancy and trust should be greater than ever.
I also think people they will not stand for brands not delivering. They will just vote with their feet, whereas the complexity of everything else going on around us, it feels like people can't make such an obvious move against this post-truth world that we're living in, whereas with brands and businesses, they'll just buy from someone else that they trust more than you. So it is fundamental to the future of the brands.
Yeah, so...
No, I was just going to say, I love what you sort of said about, particularly all of us that work in advertising, about self-importance. You always have that little sort of, thought about it's only ads, or it's only creative, or it's only, what we're selling. But look at what the data's showing us. There are audiences, many audiences that are looking for trust, and they are looking to brands, to provide that. So I think that's, a great time for us.
Yeah, I know. I mean, trust is it's the glue to life, really. And I was going to ask particularly the two advertising agency representatives about trust in relationships, because, of course, that's a terrifically important part of our world, establishing that trust. Can you talk a little bit about how important how much importance you put on that, say, Miranda?
When you say trust and relationships, do you mean just between brands and consumers, or between clients and agency, or just trust?
I was thinking more between the clients and their agencies. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's fundamental. I mean, I think when you get it right, you can have these long-term relationships with clients that last for decades, right? We're really proud to have some of those at Adam and Eve, formerly sort of DDB relationships, but there has to be that foundation of trust. It's like a good marriage, and I think that you have to work at those relationships, and you have to sort of have those cornerstone sort of values within those relationships, that you don't only deliver the work, but you do it with integrity, you do it, and it's not always going to be easy, but you need to be open and honest and have that foundation of trust for those to endure, because the best creative work comes out of those long-term relationships, because you start to really understand the DNA of that brand, where it's come from, and therefore where it's going. So, and if there's no trust there, then that becomes really, really difficult. So it's fundamental to how we do business.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think the sort of challenging truth of life for a lot of marketeers, a lot of our clients, is that I think they exist in a more exposed, lonely position in their organisations than we do in ours. And I think they need trusted partners, because sometimes they're trying to convince sceptical stakeholders to make big calls on things.
Yeah, and I wonder also whether or not the trend towards shorter terms of, say, CEOs and CFOs at the top of the big companies leads to more short-term thinking within some advertisers and they're prepared to give up some of that stuff to chase those shorter-term successes. So that's not working in our favour, I don't think, but I don't know if you agree with that.
I think you play an interesting role as an agency when there is that sort of turning over of talent on the client side, because you end up being the sort of enduring foundation of that brand. So if you can establish the right relationship, as you're right, CMOs change much more frequently than they used to, but often then they are leaning on the agency as a really trusted partner, because actually you've got that kind of that knowledge and you've got that background. So I think in the best circumstances, that can work really well for that incoming CMO as they go, okay, how can we work together to build this brand into the future? But yes, it has to come from there.
Great. Well, look, we're nearly at the end. I'm going to ask you each to give me some idea of what we could do more of. I mean, we've kind of covered the ground, but what would you say, if you had to prioritise, to be the things you'd like to see the industry doing more of to move the dial further up on that trust measure? Right.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think, this is an industry that is revered across the globe. It really is. And, all aspects of what we do combined can lead to where we need to get to. And so whether that's forms of media, whether that's around, what these tenets of truth and trust and those sort of things, yes, it's nice to think about all the shiny things, etc. But equally, it is important to do that. But I think, we've got to be mindful of the role we play for the audiences of the UK.
Great. Miranda?
I think we just have to uphold our standards, right, when everyone else is dropping theirs. So whether that comes to the messages, whether that comes to how we're creating the work, even when it comes to commitments around D&I and sustainability, let's all keep committing to those things that form the foundation of a brilliant industry that is revered by others, as they're all sort of moving away from those things.
And James?
Yeah, I think I think we have to work hard to make sure that when we're developing material and campaigns and so on, often we're having to deliver across so many more touch points and moments and occasions with budgets that can feel increasingly finite. And I think we have to challenge ourselves to keep the quality high, because our job isn't to turn up and pollute people's lives. I think if we can turn up and be beautiful or useful, even on a finite budget, then we'll probably maintain and reinforce that trust.
Definitely, and I think again, going back to our own data bank, Josh talked about the power of creativity. We also know that great ideas go a long way towards establishing trust, because that in itself is a kind of one-to-one relationship. So I guess the message from the panel is a house is in pretty good order, but we need to stay true to our real values and not lose sight, as I said at the beginning, of the fact that trust, we have to keep an eye on it, and we have to make sure we have it as high as we can possibly manage. But let me thank you all very much. It's been very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.